Okay, let's restart our next session. Yeah. Okay. It is recorded. Okay, so another technical difficulty. We call that the Paris syndrome. Yeah. Yeah. I hope so. They set the bar too low this weekend. Our next presentation is by Dr. Daniel Girgis, who's one of our liturgy experts, because we have Abuna Arsenius here, so we cannot give him the full title. He has to share it. He's going to be talking about Saint Shenouda's Procession, which I guess the book has been published by Professor Stephen Davis. And he's going to look at the Bohairic tradition as seen in this material. Okay, Daniel.
Thank you, Uncle Hani. Good morning. Hope you're all well. Dr. Hani is actually correct. Definitely not the expert, but I'm happy to be with you and to learn from you all. Perhaps the most unique custom among the many extant Coptic rituals, the feast of the desert of Upper Shenoute, the Archimandrite, whose repose in the Lord was celebrated the Sunday past, has been a topic of discussion for more than a century, though it has received particular attention in the last 30 years or so. I must admit, I feel quite inadequate and humbled speaking on this manuscript going forward with BN 68 in the presence of Dr. Janet Timby, who's written several works on the right, and Dr. Stephen Davis, who published the full manuscript in 2020, along with Drs. Daniel Schreiber and Mary Farag. That being said, an examination of this text in the light of the Bohairic tradition is imperative, specifically as it pertains to the Salmodiya, which functions as a hymnal of the nocturnal vigil, matins, and vespers, the Tamgid, which is the veneration rite in the Coptic Church, and other liturgical rites such as the anaphora or the distribution of the gifts, as it may provide insight into the date, provenance of this transcription, as well as the development of these hymns within the manuscript and their use in the current practice of the Coptic Church. Going forward, when I speak of the Bohairic psalmodies, the translations are my own, coming from a forthcoming project on a critical text of the 14th century Bohairic psalmodies, as well as referring to the Order of the Patriarchate manuscript from 1444 AD and others which I will outline. At the outset of this text, we encounter a number of Irmeniae, that is, selections from the Psalms grouped together, not by verse, but by a particular theme word or phrase, a concept which Davis treats at length. Though none of the Irmeniae written in BN 68 are utilized in practice today, the modern veneration service, or Tamgid, does retain the use of two such Irmeniae in his Qira'a Gadida Lilahnai Rashina wa Sinaat show. Michael Helmi Raghib deduces that these two hymns, which are beloved by many despite being mostly unintelligible due to their distorted text and poor translations, are in fact Irmeniae on the words Talel and Shperi, respectively. Next, we encounter Psalms 148 through 150, known as the fourth canticle or ode in the Bohairic psalmody, though not titled as such in BN 68. A few distinct features in the text of these three psalms are worth noting. The use of the Bohairic choice rather than the Sahidic choice in the first verse, as well as a jinkim of sorts instead of the superlinear on Henempawa, both of which also occur in Hibernat's M574 at the end of the 9th century. The inclusion of Ipran and Pennodi in the final verse of Psalm 150 on the top right, rendering it Maranifa Mismo Ipranim Pchois Pennodi rather than Maranifa Mismo Pchois. This difference is found in all of the 14th century Bohairic psalmodies, but it is non-existent in the Sahidic or the Bohairic scripture, and it is not present in M574, which you'll see on the bottom right. So, Maranifa Mismo Pchois, and this is concurrent in the scripture, even in the Bohairic scripture. And number 3, the addition of the Gloria Patri, followed by a number of verses, Doxasio Theosimon, Doxasio O Monogenes, and Pio Terf Meniptayo Pabenutibe as a conclusion. So this is the second one from the top on the right side. These 4 additions are not present in the 14th century Bohairic psalmodies, though they do come into play later, and are in our current liturgical texts, with the exception of Doxasio Monogenes and the Menpetayo of the final verse. It's also relevant to mention that BN 68 renders verse 7 as Afka'u Nuprostagma and Nawini, which maintains the Sahidic understanding of the psalm rather than that of the Bohairic, which has alternated several times over the centuries. Moving forward, the text adjacent to these 3 psalms is the Song of the 3 Holy Youth, entitled in BN 68 as Pihosem Mahshomt, the 3rd canticle. Not only is the title of the hymn a strictly Bohairic construct, likely from the placement of this hymn within the Psalmodiya, as Rajab pointed out in recent lectures on the manuscript, but the remainder of the text after the first 6 stanzas alternates between Greek and Bohairic Coptic. In the Coptic rite today, this song is chanted daily in Bohairic Coptic only, with one exception: the inclusion of the first Greek verse, Eulogite Pandata Erga, as a refrain after every 3 verses during the vigil of the Saturday of Joy, which is the Saturday between Good Friday and Easter Sunday. Considering this vigil on Joyous Saturday, which historically began directly after the burial rites of Good Friday, as well as Anton Baumstark's law, which states that more solemn liturgical seasons tend to maintain older liturgical usages, Rajab suggests that this manuscript may serve as a witness to an older form of the 3rd canticle within the Bohairic tradition. Once more, I would also like to highlight a number of other features that are common to the Bohairic psalmody at specific time periods. The first is the use of pefa'u in the 2nd stanza of this text, which is not in line with the scripture, but is in line with some of the Bohairic manuscripts in the 14th century. The addition of the name of Daniel the prophet in the penultimate stanza, which you can see up on the top and the right, which is also not in the 14th century psalmodies, though it has come later as an addition, and the reading of Nenioti instead of Ninodi in the final stanza. The scriptures are in line with Ninodi, God of gods, whereas most of the Bohairic manuscripts read Neniodi. 3 hymns for the 3 youth then follow the 3rd ode, Awen Yagios, the Noehen and Triompeton. Though the first 2 hymns are seemingly unattached, Though the first 2 hymns are seemingly attached, this is most probably just a scribal error, as the first hymn, Awen Yagios, is in the Adam tone, whereas the second, the Noehen Sok, is in the Watus. The former text, Awen Yagios, is also found among the set of Adam doxologies in BN 69, a 14th century psalmody, while the latter text, the Noehen Sok, is a prominent psalm that follows the 3rd canticle in the nocturnal vigil daily. I've rendered here just a comparison between BN 68 and BN 69 with relatively the same text with some interchange, and BN 68 exhibiting just a few Sahidic tendencies in comparison. While variance can be seen more clearly between these 2 attestations of the Adam hymn, the text of the Watus Tenoehen Sok, which is not depicted here, is fairly consistent between BN 68 and the Bohairic psalmodies, with the exception of the Ari Onai Neman replacing Ari Wi Neman in the 2nd stanza. Third among the 3 hymns, Triompeton, along with its pefwol, or translation, may seem familiar to the average Coptic chanter today, as it constitutes 2 verses within the so-called tenen, more properly termed Eothenin, a hymn in the midnight service, which has become quite popular for its complex, exciting melody, albeit a very late composition filled with linguistic errors in its current state. Its origins have been addressed twice by Raghib, once in قراءة جديدة للحن الثلاثة فتية القديسين, and again in his book وداس Maryam. After the Psalm and Gospel pericope are read in this portion of the service in BN 68, two distinct hymns, both named Ologimenos, are listed. The first is found also in the Patriarchate order with a title that indicates several usages. Unfortunately, this hymn has fallen out of place in today's rite. The rubric that's included in the manuscript reads, chanted in the procession of the priests and the deacons and in the procession of the martyrs and before the bride and groom and for the new patriarch and the bishop. The second Ologimenos, on the other hand, is more in line with the hymn chanted on Palm Sunday and for the entrances of the bishops today. At the conclusion of this section, we find two texts which resemble what are known as concluding canons in the Bohairic rite. Although there are slight similarities between the Sahidic and the Bohairic texts here, the Bohairic canon is not likely to be a direct descendant from the Sahidic antiphona on the left. However, the second hymn is rooted in the stichera for the resurrection chanted during Vespers for Sunday in the Byzantine rite, as shown by Raghib in Wadase, and was taken into the Coptic tradition first in Sahidic and then to the Bohairic with a few issues in translation. So this is the Greek text on the left, the Sahidic from BN 68, and what is the composite text from the Bohairic Psalmodies with some differences. I've highlighted how things have actually switched. So the Sahidic has translated Agia into Etuweb, but when it comes up into the Bohairic, they switch it to Tiyatsut. For Proti, being you first, it ended up becoming Jin and Shurb, and then Isjan Shurb in the Bohairic, which renders the translation a little bit confusing. And then finally, there is a note on the last line, Anastasis. This tepe here is likely not the pe for house, but rather the etwa for the sake of or through. Before the proemeptopos, that is the door of the holy place, the hymn listed is Sherene Maria. Of course, the first question is, which Sherene Maria? There are probably a couple hundred of them in our tradition. Well, this one in particular is what we all know as the seventh segment of the Sunday Tadakiyya. Interestingly, the text here has features which align with the 14th century psalmodies, but not the modern publications. As examples, you'll see here Otiadas Mas, which is another form of the word mes, as well as the use of panodi instead of pennodi, which is not present in any of the older manuscripts. There is another hymn in the Bohairic tradition that might be of interest to us here as it relates to the door and to Sherene Maria. In his second lecture on BN 68, Raghib draws our attention to Shashfin Sop, a melody on the seventh segment of the Sunday Tadakiyya that has become so popular that it has been incorporated into the standard psalmody as if it were one and the same with Sherene Maria. Raghib brings the two verses prior to the conclusion into conversation here. So you'll see I've highlighted these two verses in red. Through her prayers and intercessions, for us, Lord, open the doors of the church. I pray you, O Theotokos, keep the door of the churches open to the faithful. This entire melody is not present in the psalmodies of the 14th century, but there is an attestation present in the Patriarchate Ordo of 1444. These two verses are not present, however, in that attestation. So you'll see here, this is the beginning of it. When you get to the end, Asarwoki is followed directly by Marantihuero. So these two stanzas on opening the doors of the churches are not present. They are, however, present in following psalmodies that come in times that are pretty contemporaneous with this manuscript. The question extends itself then, when were these two verses added? Why were they added at that time? And is there a correlation between this opening of the doors that can give us more insight into the ritual of the desert of Apa Shenoute? Another hymn found within both BN 68 and the Bohairic tradition is Daute Estin Trapezan, come to the table. It is mentioned by Abu al-Barakat in his Misbah as the pre-sanctus hymn for the times of fasting, likely why it was linked to the liturgy of Mark Cyril for some time. Of note, a rare tune for this hymn was preserved by Ma'allim Tawfiq, who was initially raised in Suhag, but relocated and served in the monastery of the Bohairic most of his life, where he continued to be the preservatory link for many of these Sahidic hymns in the Bohairic tradition. As an example, let us turn to the beautiful, now restored, Astir Magis. Father Ugo Zanetti and Dr. Yohanan Sim have decoded this hymn in their work on manuscript 106 of the Patriarchate for the consecration of the Miron in 1374 AD. The difference between this hymn and the many others found in these manuscripts is that this one was kept alive in the tradition because or through its music. So from here, I will speak rather freely since these hymns are, they require a little less of a regimented discussion. So Astir Magis was a hymn that we knew growing up as Istirmeji, was unintelligible. The text was not very familiar to anyone, and it was preserved in one monastery, specifically in the Muharrak, as a hymn chanted for the Paramone communion of the Feast of the Nativity. We all fell in love with it growing up as children because of its very unique tune. It's only used once a year. It was very rare. And some of the oomph that was in the hymn as they chanted it in the Muharrak monastery. You'll see the common text that we received was this text on the right. Through Dr. Yohanna and Father Gozanetti's work, we can see a bit more of a sensible translation, and the same exists as well in BN 6.8. What has happened with this hymn in recent years, because we do not use Sahidic Coptic for the most part in the liturgical tradition, there have been many attempts to translate this into Bohairic Coptic and use it as a chant, which has now become the standard in many parishes. In addition, we have discovered and seen other manuscripts that now reference this hymn as used multiple times throughout the year. So a hymn that was used one time a year in one place by one group of people has now spread through the entire church and has become one of the most prominent hymns that we use. And maybe during the break, if anybody would like to hear some of these coming hymns that we'll discuss really quickly, maybe Mina can string the oud for us and we'll do a little bit of a presentation on that. Moving forward, the next hymn, known as Defte Pandis, which is usually called Zifte Bintis in most churches now, because the pronunciation is pretty distorted. We find that also the Patriarchate manuscript of the consecration of the Meirun includes it, as well as BN 6.8. And I've compared here 5 different texts for this. You'll find that the 2 older scripts, the Patriarchate and BN 6.8, are in line for the most part. And you'll find that the 3 scripts on the right are the ones published within the last, let's see if I can move this somewhere, within the last century or so. The Arsenius and the Mikhail are neither Father Arsenius that is here. The first is Abu Atallah Arsenius, who published the Tamagid book. And Mikhail here refers to one of the chanters in Canada, Albert Mikhail, who published his edition on the veneration rite. And I want to bring just one point about this hymn that is quite important to see the development of how some of our texts occurs within the church. So in these last 2 verses here, for those who are familiar with the Greek or who use the Coptic Bible app as I do, when you look up these types of words and you search them, through the Unicode, you can figure out that this is a reference to blessed are you among women and blessed is the fruit of your womb. But for the most part, in the last century or so, those who have been working on the liturgical text were not familiar and did not have these types of tools. So you'll see the text that we grew up with most of the time listening to was this Aulogimenos in Gen Nexin, Keaulogimenos tis Karbis Pescari, which nobody could understand. Now, in trying to fix this, Albert Mikhail attempts to correct it and changes it to Aulogimenos and Tigenisi, Keaulogimenos tis Karpis tis Kardi Ohara Chere Maria. Of course, this does not add up. So where did Mikhail get this from? It comes from the verse that follows, which in Sahidic makes a lot of sense. The question here is, it was understood as inhat efrashi rather than inhat rashi. And so they changed it to the fruit which gladdens your heart and altered the text, which does not add up with the original text whatsoever. Rather, it would be going forward adjusted to fismaroot jepekarbos and tatenaji. Blessed is the fruit of your womb. Finally, we'll touch on one more text, which is the very famous hymn now, Shenoute Otoke Partena, which has an interesting reception history. I don't know where the rest of the chart went. Okay, I'll have to do without it for now. Shenoute Otoke Partena is present in both the consecration of the Miron manuscript as well as BN 6.8, and it consists of 4 main verses, all of them being in Greek. And as this hymn was moved into the Bohairic tradition, we find that those 4 verses, only the last one was translated into Coptic, the last verse being one of the Psalms, Tiprepi Imnos, which is here in Tokipnodia Fershaunak and Jebi Jochen Sion. The last verse, as it moves into the Bohairic tradition, forgoes the style and the structure musically of the Sahidic use and takes on a more common Bohairic style, which is the long melisma, a connection to a procession of sorts, and a repetitious style that does change from church to church. Whereas the Sahidic retains a very quick, repetitive, simple style that most of the people can pick up on. And in today's rite, the most interesting thing is that both have sort of been fused. So they will keep some of the verses in that very short, quick, upbeat tone, which is a different scale from the Bohairic melisma that comes in, but somehow we figured out a way to manage and mix the two. And it's become one of the most popular hymns. I think, just of note, I think on my personal SoundCloud, I posted one recording that was a live, kind of upbeat, enjoyable rendition of it, and it's gotten hundreds of thousands of plays, and people across the world began learning it just because of how it was presented. As a final note, the music of the Copts not only plays a role in the transmission of the liturgical tradition, but as we spoke yesterday, it has a role in the handing down of our own identity and the preservation of our community. And with that, I'll conclude. Thank you all very much.
Second and last hymn is the fruit of your womb. Oh, sorry. That second and last hymn, blessed is the fruit of your womb. You're making the claim that the editors or the redactors didn't know the Coptic version of the text?
So if you look at the actual text itself, the text is in its structure. I forgot to mention this, so thank you for bringing this up. Both of these hymns, Astir Magis and Defte Pandis, are a verse in Greek and a verse in Sahidic Coptic. So there's a mix of both. But when the translations or the understanding of the Greek is not there, those who are translating into Coptic, and you'll notice it in Astir Magis especially, the Coptic translation is not exact. It's an approximation of what's done in the Greek. And they don't maintain the same structure. So in the Greek, this is an acrostic, alpha, beta, gamma, delta, etc. But in the Coptic, they don't retain the same structure, right? For Defte Pandis, these additions have occurred within the last century or so. The familiarity with Greek is not there. The text itself, even if it was at one point familiar to people's ears in Greek, is no longer understood because it has been morphed multiple times. So coming to make a translation from this to try to make sense of the Greek, they're trying to, especially in these last two verses, what Albert did was attempt to correct the Greek based on what he understood of the Coptic. So it was an inverted adjustment of the text. So
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Danny. This is wonderful. And we've been waiting for a while now for studies of this manuscript, not just its publication of its text and its translation, which was done before, but to dig into it further for its liturgical history lessons that we're seeing here. You've pointed out a lot of examples here of overlap or features of BN 68 and its hymnographic texts that also show up sometimes the same way, sometimes slightly differently in the Bohairic tradition. And I think it would be great to start thinking of, I'm always fascinated by the regional history of, to use the term borrowed from Byzantine studies, the regional history of Coptic liturgical practice. And the interplay, especially around the end of the first millennium and the beginning of the second, between southern traditions, exemplified, of course, in the White Monastery and other locations, and what eventually became the standard Bohairic tradition that we find in the second millennium manuscripts. And I guess my question would be, do you see here a general trend where similarities between southern material and the Bohairic rites are perhaps evidence of the spread of the Bohairic tradition southward from center to periphery? Or do you see it more as survival and sort of the afterlife of southern material making its way north and being sort of repurposed and put to use in slightly different ways in kind of the center sometimes absorbs things from the periphery and, you know, makes use of it. In one case, you even pointed out similarity to a hymn with the Stichira the Anastasis, and that's Jerusalem material. And therefore, there's another kind of way that this could happen now, where it's not just North and South speaking to each other, but Byzantine Hagiopolite material basically influencing the Egyptian tradition at large. So do you see here a general trend, or is it just a case-by-case basis and we're not yet prepared to make grand theories, I suppose? That's one question. I have a couple of other notes, but yes.
For that, thank you, Winner, for that question. My typical answer to this is yes and no, both. It depends on the type of hymn. So as an example, it's very interesting to me that these specific hymns, the ones that we talked about, whether they be Rashine and Sanacho, or Defte Pandis, or any of these other things, are taken into things like the veneration rites, right? There's a part of this, I remember growing up, one of our priests, his mother had grown up in Luxor, and she told me that they would get together for these mulids or these celebrations and sing these hymns as part of their general practice. So the idea that you'll notice that the tunes are very simple, they're easy for people to pick up, they're repetitive, similar words. So in some of these cases, it seems that these popular practices were preserved in their very festal, celebratory gatherings, both possibly liturgically and paraliturgically, which then transfers up north from Upper Egypt, because this was their typical practice. In other cases, however, you might find influence that goes the opposite direction. So I think the communication, something like Sherete Otoke, the hymn itself is likely to have traveled in terms of a text going from one direction, from south to north, but the music is likely going the opposite direction now. And so I don't think it's a one size fits all. I think it's a case by case, but there definitely can be trends depending on how the hymn was used and how it fits into people's lives. So that would be
that's great. And you point out another aspect that I didn't think about, but it's actually very interesting. The fact that a lot of these traditions, both musically and textually, have begin their life as so-called popular religion. And we often tend to forget this, at least in our discussions and in the community, assuming a sort of top-down spread of official texts that are written by official delegated authorities that are creating a tradition. But oftentimes the process can be the other way, where it's the regularization and taking on of what is an organic popular practice and then making it official by putting a stamp of approval on it, maybe cleaning up a little bit, but that kind of thing. And then the other thing that kind of brings me to my last point, just so I don't take too much time, but it would be interesting also moving forward, not just to explore these regional dynamics, but also the variable uses of a particular text in let's say in the procession of Shenouda versus the Bohairic rite. You're pointing out things where some hymn might have functioned in a processional context, maybe because of its relation to an idea of a door or some other landmark. But then in the Bohairic rite, it's taken in a kind of a different key and plays a different role in the Bohairic tradition. And these differences, I think, are very instructive in their own way. But thank you so much.
Thank you.
Last question.
Thank you so much for a very beautiful presentation. I have a question from the linguistic perspective. In the newer Bohairic psalmody or newer Bohairic hymns, I found in your presentation there are many like replacement of the postposed subject with enge versus like incorporate subject like puro and so on. But in the newer hymns, for me, it seems it tends to use like enge puro and so on. Do you think this kind of tendency exists with this kind of like subject transposition?
Specifically, are you asking going from Sahidic to Bohairic or just in general within Bohairic?
In Bohairic.
I mean, it's relatively common. I can't say that I have specifically looked into how many instances or how often, but it is very common. And I think specifically the use of inje, I think there was a text I was working on last week for one of the Gospels where it's a Gospel pericope from Luke, and the Bohairic text, they drop the ni in the inje, and it causes a lot of problems. And so how they're using the inje and when they're using it, it needs to be, I think, more studied. But it is something that I encounter quite often in the text.
Also in newer hymns, newer psalmody, or
Not necessarily.
necessary in
necessarily.
general.
What I've been working on in the last couple of years is the Bohairic psalmody, specifically from the 14th century and on. And at that point, there's tons of use of that. We also have to take in the musical aspect into consideration. How the texts are being chanted impacts how they order the words or whether they drop some of the words. So there's a tadakiyah for one of the weekdays where the text should read insa, and they change it to just nt, insa instead of insati. So they drop a lot of these phrases or these syllables pertaining to how they're actually chanting the text at times as well. So where the text is functioning and how it's being chanted also impacts how they use these the subject marker.
See, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Let's get the electronics.